The day the scholarship committee called, I was sitting in the school counselor's office watching the rain move sideways across the window. It was the kind of March rain that couldn't decide whether to be serious about itself. Cold enough to sting, not committed enough to matter. The counselor had asked me to come in before first period. She was a careful woman, the kind who selected her words slowly and precisely, as if they were objects she was arranging on a shelf. She set a printed email on the desk between us and folded her hands over it, and she looked at me with the particular expression that people wear when they have to deliver news they didn't create and can't fix. "They've withdrawn the preliminary invitation," she said. "I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you before you heard it from someone else." I picked up the email and read it twice. The language was the kind of formal, insulated corporate prose designed to communicate a decision while simultaneously taking no responsibility for it. Phrases like reputational environment and circumstances surrounding the applicant's family profile and institutional risk considerations. Between the lines of that careful language, the meaning was simple enough. The Harlow National Economics Scholarship, the one I had spent 4 months preparing to win, and then 43 days allowing myself to begin believing in, was gone. It had come to me in February, a letter that my mother had read 3 times before handing it to me at the kitchen table, her eyes doing something she didn't have words for, and now, in March, it was revoked. I set the email back on the desk. I looked at the rain against the window. My father had been in a holding facility 2 counties away for 11 days. My mother was running the phones from our kitchen table, trying to find a lawyer who would take a payment plan. The company my parents had spent 14 years building from a single leased truck was frozen, accounts suspended, contracts stalled, drivers going unpaid, while a state commerce investigator went through every invoice and maintenance log going back to the first year of operation. The scholarship committee had read about it in a regional business publication that had picked up the investigation story, amplified it in the particular way that regional publications amplify anything that looks like institutional wrongdoing, and concluded that an applicant whose parents were under investigation for financial irregularities was not the kind of student they wanted associated with their program. I understood the logic completely. That was perhaps the worst part. I understood every step of the mechanism that had just closed a door on me, and understanding it did not make it any less final. "I understand," I said. I folded the email and put it in my jacket pocket without asking if I could take it. The counselor said something after that. I caught fragments about resilience, about alternative scholarship programs, about the school's commitment to supporting students through family difficulties. But I was already somewhere else. Not emotionally elsewhere, strategically elsewhere. Somewhere in my mind, behind the immediate sensation of the loss, a colder and more durable process had already begun. I was 17 years old. I was sitting in a school counselor's office in a jacket I had bought at a thrift store, specifically for the scholarship interview, which I had been preparing for and which would now not happen. And I was already, in a way that I didn't yet have language for, beginning to work. I did not know, sitting there, exactly what I was beginning. I knew only that I had just been shown the shape of a system I had not previously seen clearly, and that the shape of it required a response. Not an emotional one, an architectural one. 22 years later, I would walk into a closed creditors meeting in a building downtown and sit across a conference table from Kyle Davenport. I would be the largest single representative of the creditor group that held effective control over his family's construction empire. He would look at me across the table with the expression of a man who has just understood the dimensions of something he should have understood much earlier. And I would not need to say anything that morning that wasn't already expressed by the documents in front of us. But that morning was at the end of a very long road. Let me take you back to the beginning of it. My parents started the company the year I turned 4. My father had been driving for other people's operations since he was 22. Freight runs, regional distribution, whatever work the phone produced, and at 31, having saved carefully and borrowed modestly from a credit union that took a chance on him, he leased a single truck and signed a freight contract with a mid-size warehouse operation that needed reliable regional coverage. The contract paid enough to cover the lease, the insurance, the fuel, and a modest salary that left very little margin for error. My mother handled the paperwork, the federal motor carrier filings, the state registrations, the quarterly tax submissions, the insurance renewals, the customer invoicing. She did it from the kitchen table while I was in the other room. By the time I was in middle school, they had 8 trucks and 12 drivers. They had moved out of the original warehouse unit into a small office building with a dispatch area and a maintenance bay. They had a steady commercial customer base and the beginnings of a government contract relationship, a county road department that used their services for aggregate hauling. My father knew every driver's name, knew which ones had families to get home to on weekends, and which ones could take the overnight runs, knew which equipment needed watching and which was solid. My mother had become, by this point, genuinely expert in transportation regulatory compliance, not because anyone taught her, but because the regulations had consequences and she was the person who had to manage them. By my sophomore year of high school, the company was running 23 vehicles across 4 states. They had a minor but stable contract with a regional grocery distribution network and were in early discussions with a county infrastructure authority about a potential government logistics contract that would have been, for them, a significant step towards something more stable. They were not wealthy. They had never taken a vacation that lasted more than 4 days. They drove used cars and bought appliances on sale and sent me to the same public high school everyone in the neighborhood attended. But they were on a trajectory that was real, that was built, that was theirs. They had built it without political connections, without club memberships, without a single relationship cultivated over golf or charity dinners, without anyone's favor. This was a point of pride for my father in a way that, as a child, I had absorbed as simply a fact about how things worked. You built things through effort, and effort was rewarded. He said it plainly and often enough that it had become part of the structure of how I understood the world. It took me a long time to understand that this belief had also left them exposed. When you have no relationships with the people who control the regulatory environment, you have no warning system. No one calls ahead. No one suggests that a compliance review is coming and recommends you ensure your paperwork is in order. You simply wake up one morning and there is an official at your door with paperwork. Kyle Davenport had attended my high school since freshman year, and in the way of high school social physics, he occupied a different orbital than I did without any particular hostility or antagonism on either side. We coexisted. We were occasionally in the same classes. He was, I want to be honest about this, not a stupid person. He was competitive and intelligent and accustomed to winning, and he navigated the social landscape of high school with the ease of someone who has never had to think strategically about it, because the landscape has always already been configured in his favor. His father was Harrison Davenport, a name that appeared in the local business press regularly and without friction, the kind of name that communities like ours produced occasionally, and then organized a significant portion of their civic life around. Harrison Davenport had spent 30 years building a real estate and construction empire, commercial developments, mixed-use projects, infrastructure construction, and the government-adjacent contracts that required not just technical competence, but careful management of relationships with the officials who awarded them. He sat on the boards of civic organizations. He donated to both political parties. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who understood that the regulatory environment was not a natural phenomenon to be navigated. It was a social environment to be cultivated. Kyle wore this inheritance the way some people wear their most comfortable clothes, without thinking about it because it fit. He did not appear to resent the advantages of his position or feel guilty about them. He simply occupied them. What I noticed, in the limited attention I paid to him during our first 2 years of school, was that he had a particular sensitivity to being second. He could lose gracefully in contexts that didn't matter to him. He could not lose gracefully in contexts that did. I won the regional economics competition in October of junior year. I had spent 4 months preparing, studying microeconomic theory, trade policy, game theory, monetary systems, international economics, at a depth that the competition probably didn't strictly require, but I didn't know how to prepare any other way. The preparation was its own logic. My mother helped me make flashcards on the kitchen table on weekends. My father sat in the audience at the regional finals with his arms crossed and his face doing the specific thing it did when he was trying to contain something he was feeling strongly. When I placed first, the announcement came over the room's PA system, and the sound that came from my parents in the audience was involuntary. A single unified sound from two people simultaneously surprised by something they had allowed themselves to hope for. I was embarrassed by it in the way that teenagers are embarrassed by their parents' love, and I was also, underneath that embarrassment, entirely undone by it. The national competition was in January. The preparation intensified. I worked at the school library until they locked the doors and then continued at the public library 2 blocks away. I requested practice problem sets from the organization's archive. I wrote practice essays on historical economic policy decisions and asked my economics teacher to grade them, which he did, with annotations that got more detailed as the weeks passed, and he began to take seriously what I was trying to do. I placed first at nationals. The announcement came by email, and I read it alone in my room at 6 a.m. before school, and I sat with it for a long time before going downstairs. The Harlow National Economic Scholarship preliminary invitation arrived 3 weeks later. It was conditional, subject to final committee review, background verification, institutional standing confirmation, but it was real. It was a letter on heavyweight paper with a seal at the top, and it said that based on my academic record, competition performance, and supplemental materials, I had been selected as a preliminary invitee for full consideration. The scholarship funded a year of study at an affiliated institution in London. It was the kind of thing that didn't happen to students from this school. It had never happened before to anyone from this county, as far as anyone could find a record of. The school announced it in the morning bulletin. By the end of first period, everyone in the building knew. Kyle found me in the hallway before third period. He fell into step beside me without preamble, which was unusual, and he said something like, "Heard about the scholarship. That's impressive." And we shook hands briefly. His handshake lasted half a second longer than it needed to, and his smile, when I looked at it directly, was occupying the position where a genuine smile would be without quite being one. I said thank you. I thought nothing further about it. I had no framework at that point for what I was observing. 6 weeks later, the state commerce inspection arrived at my parents' office on a Tuesday morning. The first investigator appeared with paperwork describing a routine compliance review, an audit of the company's fuel subsidy reporting practices. This was not, in itself, alarming. My parents had always maintained careful records and had never had a significant compliance issue. My mother began pulling the relevant documentation immediately. By Thursday of that week, the investigation had expanded. Additional investigators, additional document requests, expanded scope. By the following Monday, the company's primary operating accounts had been frozen, pending resolution of what the investigators were now describing as potential irregularities in fuel subsidy classification and possible fraudulent certification of certain government contract eligibility requirements. Within 2 weeks, the language in the filings had escalated further. Within 3 weeks, the story had been picked up by a regional business publication. The headline was careful. It used words like alleged and under investigation. but the photograph they chose for the online version showed the company's logo on one of the truck doors, and by that evening the story had been shared widely enough that 3 of their commercial customers had called to express concern, and 1 had quietly suspended the routing contract pending resolution. My father was called in for questioning at the State Commerce Office 3 times in the 4th week. The 3rd time they asked him not to leave. He was held for questioning under what the investigating authority called a voluntary cooperation arrangement, which meant he had not been formally charged but also had limited practical ability to simply walk out. My mother called a lawyer. The lawyer said the situation, while serious, was not unusual in the context of regulatory investigations of this kind, and that her husband's cooperation was the right posture, and that the fee to represent the family going forward would be $15,000, which they did not have. She found another lawyer. This one took the case for expenses plus a reduced fee if and when a settlement was reached. She covered the expenses by selling the equity stake in one of the trucks. My father was held for 11 days. I went to school during those 11 days. I sat in my classes and took notes. I did not tell anyone except the counselor, who had to know because of a scheduling issue with a competition follow-up event. At night, I came home to a kitchen where my mother sat at the table surrounded by documents, running the phones, preparing filings, keeping the operational situation from deteriorating faster than it already was. I would sit beside her and go through what I could read and understand, which was more than most teenagers could have processed, and considerably less than what was actually needed. I made her tea. I took over the phone calls she couldn't make before 10 p.m. because the people she needed to reach kept business hours. I held as much of it as I could carry. What I was learning, sitting at that table in the evenings, was something that would take years to fully formulate, but that was entering me then in raw form. The formal allegation does not need to be large to cause catastrophic damage. The damage mechanism is not the fine, it is the suspension. Frozen accounts meant drivers weren't paid on schedule. Drivers who weren't paid on schedule began calling to ask what was happening. Some of them stopped showing up for shifts while the situation was unresolved, which was entirely rational from their perspective and devastating from ours. Contracts that couldn't be reliably serviced were quietly transferred to backup carriers. A business that had taken 14 years to build could be functionally dismantled in 3 months without a single accusation ever reaching a verdict. My father came home from the holding facility on a Wednesday afternoon, looking like someone who had spent 11 days inside a procedural machine and was still processing the experience. He had not been charged with anything. He had been questioned at length about invoices and certifications and classification decisions that he had made in good faith over years of business operation, decisions that were now being characterized through a particular interpretive lens as potential violations. He sat at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a while without speaking. The scholarship committee withdrew the invitation 10 days later. The letter cited reputational considerations. I read that letter in the counselor's office and put it in my pocket and walked through the rest of the school day like someone moving through water. Not crying, not in visible distress, just processing, at some level below conscious thought, a recalibration. The future I'd been imagining had a specific shape. London, the scholarship, the particular institutional trajectory that followed from that kind of start. And that shape was no longer available. There was nothing to be done about it immediately. I filed it. The investigation concluded 7 months later. The charges were reduced, restructured, and mostly dropped. The state issued a finding of no significant wrongdoing and assessed an administrative penalty of $800 for what they characterized as a reporting classification ambiguity, the specific category under which certain fuel expenditures had been filed, which differed from the adjacent category the investigators believed was correct. The monetary difference, had the company's categorization been found definitively wrong, would have amounted to less than $4,000. The accounts had been frozen for 6 months. The press coverage had been picked up in 3 regional publications and 1 national trade newsletter. By the time the finding was issued, the business was gone, not destroyed dramatically, just systematically evacuated. Customers who had found alternative arrangements and stayed with them, drivers who had found other employment, contracts that had been transferred and not recovered, credit lines that had been suspended during the review and not reinstated. The company did not collapse in a single moment. It receded over months, like water from a damaged vessel. What remained was debt, operational liabilities, the lawyer's fees, a commercial lease on the office space that ran for another 14 months. I saw Kyle Davenport twice during this period in ways that registered. The first time was in the school parking lot about 6 weeks into the investigation. We made eye contact across 2 rows of cars. He was with a group of friends, and for a moment something moved across his face that I couldn't read precisely. Not guilt exactly, not satisfaction exactly, but something more ambiguous than either, something that might have been recognition. He looked away first. I walked to my car and drove home. The second time was at an end-of-year event for upperclassmen, an informal gathering at the school that I attended because not attending would have felt like a concession I wasn't prepared to make. Kyle found me near the drink table, which I think was not accidental. He stood beside me with a cup in his hand and said something about what a tough year it had been for my family. The way people say things they've rehearsed so many times they've lost the texture of them. Then he paused, adjusted the collar of his blazer, a blazer that cost more than the administrative penalty that had been the entire formal finding against my father's 14 years of work. And he said, "In this world, the one with more resources wins." He said it the way someone states a law of physics, a thing so obvious it barely requires articulation. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about my father's hands on the kitchen table the afternoon he came home. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone at 11 p.m. explaining the situation to a lawyer who would eventually decide not to take the case. I thought about the scholarship letter in my jacket pocket. I looked at Kyle Davenport, who was watching me with a mild expectation of someone waiting to see whether I would respond emotionally, and I said nothing. I picked up my drink and walked to the other side of the room. He probably found it anticlimactic. He probably forgot about it within a week. I have not forgotten it once. I enrolled at a state university in the fall. This requires a word of clarification. It was not my second choice or my consolation prize. It was a real institution with a strong economics department and a law school on the same campus where, with faculty permission, undergraduates could audit graduate courses. I had chosen it deliberately for the combination, for the proximity to legal education that I knew by then I needed. I worked 20 hours a week at an accounting firm doing data entry and reconciliation. The pay was $11 an hour. I covered half my rent and part of my textbooks. My parents covered the rest from what had survived the settlement, which was not enough, but was what there was. My first year I focused on survival, academically, financially, logistically. I had no margin for error on any front. My second year, I began to focus on something more specific. I had a question, and the question was not abstract. How had it worked? Not the emotional dimension of what had happened to my family. I had set that aside, or rather, I had compressed it into something dense and cold that I kept at the center of my chest, where it would generate energy without distracting me. The question was structural. How had a regulatory inspection that found $800 of administrative ambiguity been leveraged into the destruction of a 14-year business? Who had initiated it? What was the mechanism? How did the sequence of events, investigation, press coverage, account freeze, contract loss, business collapse, connect, and who had pulled the first thread? I didn't have direct evidence. I had a hypothesis that I treated as a working assumption, and I had a decision. whether to focus on proving the past or understanding the mechanism well enough to eventually act on it. The past was gone. The mechanism was present and ongoing. I chose the mechanism. I audited 2 courses in the law school during my sophomore year. The first was Corporate Structures and Liability. The second was a graduate seminar on regulatory compliance frameworks, taught by a former state attorney with the narrow, precise manner of someone who had spent decades converting legal complexity into prosecutorial strategy. After I submitted a written response to a hypothetical in the compliance seminar, an analysis of how a coordinated sequence of regulatory actions could be structured to maximize operational damage to a target entity while maintaining formal procedural legitimacy, the professor asked me to stay after class. He said it was the most technically sophisticated analysis he had seen from an auditing student. He asked what year I was. He offered me a research position at $12 an hour with access to the law library after hours. I accepted without negotiating, which was a mistake I would not repeat. In that library, over the following 2.5 years, I built the intellectual foundation of everything that came after. I was systematic about it in a way that I think requires explanation, because I studied a lot, doesn't capture what actually happened. I constructed a curriculum for myself based on the specific vulnerabilities my family's situation had exposed. I started with distressed debt markets, the mechanics of purchasing loan positions in default or near default from original lenders at a discount, the leverage those positions provided over the borrowing entity, the ways that leverage could be applied in restructuring negotiations. I moved to public procurement systems, the regulatory architecture governing government, contracts, the oversight mechanisms, and specifically the points in those mechanisms where interested parties could insert influence through relationships with oversight personnel. I studied corporate holding structures, the subsidiary arrangements, the layered entities, the ways that true control could be insulated from formal ownership for purposes of both regulatory protection and strategic maneuver. And I spent a great deal of time studying what I came to think of as the architecture of coordinated pressure, the specific sequencing of regulatory, legal, financial, and reputational actions that, applied in the right order against a target without the resources to respond to all of them simultaneously, could produce outcomes that looked like the natural consequence of the target's own deficiencies, but weren't. That last subject was the most important. It was what had been done to my family, and understanding it from the inside, understanding the design rather than just experiencing the effect, was the only basis on which I could imagine building a response that was something other than futile. My mistake, in the years immediately following law school, was a version of the mistake that many capable but insufficiently experienced people make. I confused knowledge with leverage. I thought that because I understood the mechanisms, could map the structures, identify the weak points, trace the sequences, I was therefore positioned to act on that understanding. I wasn't. Understanding without capital, institutional standing, and the specific relationships that allowed access to the relevant arenas was just a very detailed map of a country I couldn't enter. The manifestation of this mistake was a consulting engagement I took during my second year of law school. A small hedge fund recruited law students for a specific litigation project. Distressed asset analysis, which was exactly the territory I'd been studying. The work was interesting, and the pay was good relative to my circumstances, and the fund's principals presented themselves as sophisticated operators in a niche I wanted to be in. Over 6 months, I produced deep structural analysis of a complex distressed asset situation that the fund was considering pursuing. The analysis was genuinely excellent. I knew this not from arrogance, but from the clarity of the reasoning and the precision of the structural mapping. It identified leverage points in the situation that the fund's own team had not seen. 18 months later, a business press note mentioned in passing that the fund had successfully acquired a controlling creditor position in the situation I had analyzed and had executed a restructuring that generated returns in the range of several $1,000,000. My compensation for those 6 months of analysis had been $8,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. I had priced myself like a student because I still thought of myself as one. I had given away my most valuable work for a fraction of its actual worth because I didn't understand that expertise without ownership is simply labor with a fancy name. I had not built any participation in the outcome. I had not structured the engagement to include any share of the upside. I had not even charged a rate that reflected the quality of what I was providing. I sat with this for a long time, not with anger. Anger at a mistake is just a way of not accounting for it, but with a kind of focused attention to exactly what had gone wrong and what it implied going forward. The implication was clear. I needed to stop being a skilled resource for other people's platforms and build my own. That required capital, which required a track record, which required getting inside an institution long enough to demonstrate the track record. I had years of work ahead of me before I could begin. I passed the bar and joined a small firm that specialized in corporate debt restructuring. The pay was modest by legal standards and comfortable by the standards I had been living. The work was exactly what I needed. I was not, in those early years, the most socially fluent person in client meetings. I was not the most polished presenter. I was, consistently, the most prepared person in the room. And I had learned, watching cases evolve, that preparation compounds in a way that social fluency doesn't. In a restructuring negotiation, what matters most is not who walks in with the best presence. It is who walks in with the deepest understanding of the other side's actual constraints, the ones they haven't disclosed and possibly don't fully understand themselves. I became the person they sent into the most complex situations, not because my seniors were recognizing my ambition. They were, but that wasn't the primary driver, but because I kept producing outcomes in situations that had looked intractable. I developed a reputation in a specific and narrow niche. I was the person who could walk into a distressed situation where both sides had hardened positions and identify the specific structural concession that each side could make without acknowledging defeat, that would allow the deal to close. It was not glamorous work. It was exactly the right work. I also, during this period, stopped allowing myself emotional distraction in any form I couldn't afford. This was less a decision than an evolution. I had relationships that didn't survive the weight of what I was carrying. The focus, the hours, the way a particular kind of ongoing project has of occupying every available cognitive space. Each time a relationship ended, I registered it with a feeling I couldn't quite locate precisely, like pressure in a room with no specific point of origin. I told myself it was the trade-off. I told myself there would be time for those things later. Later became a category I deferred to so consistently that it stopped feeling hypothetical and started feeling like a place I actually planned to go. I left the firm after 4 years and joined a mid-sized investment fund as a senior analyst. The transition required me to stop thinking like a lawyer, which is to say, stop thinking about how to interpret the rules of a situation and start thinking about how to take positions in it. The fund's focus was distressed credit, which meant we bought the debt of companies in financial difficulty at a discount to face value, and then managed those positions through either restructuring negotiations or sale. It was, in structural terms, exactly the arena I'd been studying for a decade and a half. During my years at the fund, I began doing something I'd been preparing for but had not formally initiated. I began tracking the Davenport family's business in a systematic way. Not obsessively, the work at the fund occupied the majority of my attention, and I was not letting it slip, but consistently. I had a file. I read the regional business press from home, which was available online. I followed the construction and infrastructure trade publications that covered the sector the Davenport company operated in. I tracked their public filings when disclosure was required. What I was watching over those years was a picture of growth that was real and impressive and structurally fragile in ways that were not immediately apparent from the surface. Harrison Davenport had begun transitioning operational leadership to Kyle by the time I joined the fund. Kyle had expanded the family's construction arm aggressively into public infrastructure, roads, bridges, municipal facility construction, which required bidding on and winning large government contracts, which in turn required the political relationships the family had spent decades maintaining. The company won contracts. It also borrowed substantially to finance the working capital requirements of those contracts, which were large and paid on government timelines that lagged behind actual costs by months. The credit facilities it had established were standard for the industry and manageable in stable conditions. In a tightening credit environment, certain elements of those facilities were specific pressure points. I made partner at the fund 2 years after joining. I was offered the following year a full equity partnership. I declined it respectfully, citing a desire to eventually launch my own structure. This was true, and it was also the beginning of the specific positioning I had been building toward. I left the fund with 6 institutional relationships willing to commit capital to a vehicle I would manage, a founding team of 3 people I trusted completely, and a specific investment thesis that I had spent years preparing to execute. I launched the firm when I was 37. The thesis was narrow. We would focus on acquiring secondary creditor positions in overextended companies in capital-intensive industries, with particular emphasis on the infrastructure and construction sectors. We had specific frameworks for analyzing covenant structures in the credit facilities typical to those sectors, identifying the conditions under which technical default was likely, and calculating the position size at which our stake would give us effective influence over restructuring outcomes. We were not the only firm operating in this territory. We were the firm that had thought about it the most carefully for the longest time. The first 3 years were the hardest period of my professional life, and I want to be specific about why. The technical work was not the difficulty. It was what I had been building toward for 2 decades, and I was good at it and getting better. The difficulty was everything that surrounded the technical work. Raising capital from investors who are evaluating not just your thesis, but your institutional stability. Managing a team that is dependent on your leadership at a level that is different from any individual contributor role. Building operational infrastructure that allows you to execute at institutional scale. Sustaining the conviction of the original strategy through market periods when it produces limited activity. I had been, my entire career, an individual contributor of one kind or another. Being the person who builds and maintains the institution, rather than operating within one, required me to develop capacities that I had deliberately set aside in favor of technical depth. I had to learn them largely in real time, from situations that had actual consequences. My social life during this period was, for practical purposes, non-existent. I don't say this as a grievance. I say it because it is true, and because it is relevant to what comes later. The particular kind of sustained focus required to build an institution from scratch does not coexist easily with the sustained attention that relationships require. I knew this going in. What I had not fully anticipated was the way that the isolation became self-reinforcing. The fewer social connections you maintain, the less practice you have at maintaining them, and the more foreign the rhythms of ordinary intimacy begin to feel. I was good at work. I was increasingly unpracticed at everything else. My parents were healthy and living in the same town, in the same neighborhood. My father drove freight for a regional company. Other people's trucks, other people's routes, a schedule and a paycheck rather than the building of something. My mother had gone back to school in her 50s and completed a medical billing certification. She worked for a clinic. They were stable. They were not the people they had been before the investigation. Nobody survives that kind of systematic dismantling without being altered at some structural level, but they were intact. They did not talk about the company much. The silence around it had become a kind of accommodation they had made with themselves. I did not tell them what I was working toward. This was a deliberate decision and not an entirely comfortable one. I did not tell them because I could not guarantee the outcome, and I would not give them something to hope for that might not arrive. If I succeeded, they would know when it happened. If I didn't, they would be spared the additional loss of having hoped for it. Now I need to explain what I did carefully, because the precision of it matters in two ways. It matters because the actions themselves are specific and require accurate description, and it matters because I want to be clear that none of it operated outside the framework of legitimate financial activity. What I did was use the system, the same regulatory, legal, and financial architecture that had been used against my family, to accomplish results that the system exists, in theory, to accomplish. The people who had applied that architecture against my parents had done so corruptly. I applied it correctly, through a series of investment vehicles that are standard institutional practice for managing position concentration and investor exposure. My firm began acquiring secondary market positions in the debt of the Davenport Holding Company's largest credit facility. This was publicly traded debt, available to any qualified institutional buyer. I was not the only buyer who had concerns about the Davenport Company's financial ratios. The broader market for infrastructure sector credit had become more cautious as the economic cycle entered a softer phase, and other sophisticated participants had noted some of the same vulnerabilities I had identified. Our purchases were made in the normal course of institutional investment. They were documented, reported appropriately, and entirely legal. Simultaneously, an independent risk analytics firm that had received early-stage capital from an entity affiliated with my fund began publishing research on vulnerability patterns in leveraged infrastructure financing. The research was rigorous. It relied on publicly available data, credit ratings, covenant structures from disclosed filings, sector-wide financial ratio trends. It identified, with clinical precision and no specific targeting of any named company, the conditions under which companies with the Davenport Holding Company's profile were likely to experience covenant pressure. Institutional lenders read the research. It contributed to conversations they were already having. It made certain questions more likely to be asked at the next monitoring review. I also paid attention to supply chain dynamics in the Davenport Company's construction operations. My fund's portfolio included companies that competed with or supplied to vendors in those supply chains. I made investment decisions that reflected my fund's genuine commercial interests in those situations, which also, in several cases, created friction in pricing and logistics for Davenport projects. I did not manufacture conflicts where none existed. I identified situations where my fund's interests and the Davenport network overlapped, and I acted on my fund's interests. This is called business. It is what happens in competitive markets. The economic environment cooperated, not in any dramatic way, but in the consistent, grinding way that sustained pressure eventually produces structural change. Public infrastructure spending contracted modestly in 2 consecutive budget cycles. Contract timelines extended. Cash conversion on completed work slowed. The Davenport Company's financial ratios, which had been marginally inside their covenant thresholds, moved marginally outside them over 3 consecutive quarters. In the 4th quarter of the 3rd year, after I had begun accumulating positions, the primary credit facility declared a technical default. A technical default is a specific legal condition, not a bankruptcy. It is the activation of a contractual trigger, the lender's right to demand immediate repayment of the full outstanding amount, or to negotiate a forbearance agreement that modifies the terms of the debt in exchange for the lenders agreeing not to exercise the acceleration right. Forbearance requires the consent of a sufficient percentage of the creditor group, defined by the credit agreement. The negotiation of that forbearance, the closed-door meetings where the actual restructuring terms are determined, is where effective power resides. Our creditor block held, through the accumulated positions across multiple vehicles, a percentage of the outstanding debt that gave us effective veto power over any forbearance proposal. We were the largest single creditor group in the room. The closed creditors meeting was held in a conference room on the 34th floor of a building downtown on a Wednesday morning in November. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city in a way designed to remind participants of scale and significance. 12 people on the creditor side, 4 on the Davenport Company's side, Kyle, 2 senior executives, and a restructuring advisor who had clearly been retained very recently and was still absorbing the dimensions of the situation. I entered with 2 colleagues. I set my materials on the table. I said good morning to the people near me. I did not make an entrance. Kyle recognized me from across the table. I watched the recognition happen, the slight recalibration of expression, the momentary stillness, the look that moved from my face to the nameplate identifying my fund's position to my face again. He had been briefed, certainly. He knew in the abstract that a fund associated with my name held a significant position in his company's debt. But knowing in the abstract and sitting across a conference table from it, with the morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the documents laid out in front of everyone in the room, are different experiences of the same fact. The meeting ran for 4 hours. I was prepared with a level of structural specificity that, I was aware, exceeded what the Davenport team had anticipated. When they proposed forbearance terms, I responded with point-by-point analysis of why each component was inconsistent with the credit agreement provisions and market precedent for comparable situations. When their restructuring advisor attempted to move discussions toward procedural questions that would delay substantive terms, I redirected with specific citation to relevant agreement language. When the room fell silent, and it did several times in the particular way rooms fall silent, when one party realizes the other has done a different order of preparation, I let the silence extend without filling it. During the break in the afternoon session, Kyle came to where I was standing near the windows. He did not bring his team. He stood beside me and looked at the city for a moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Was this personal?" I looked at him. Older now, we both were. The ease of his posture was still there, but it was a diminished version of itself, carrying the specific weight of a man who has spent several weeks receiving information that contradicts his model of the situation. He had the particular expression of someone trying to locate the edges of something that keeps being larger than they expected. "It was about choices," I said. "You chose pressure. I chose preparation." He was quiet, then lower. "My father, I know what your father did," I said. "I studied it for 20 years. The silence between us was very specific, not the silence of unfinished conversation, the silence of a conversation that has said everything it needed to. We went back to the table when the break ended. The meeting concluded with an agreement to continue negotiations on a revised forbearance framework over the following 3 weeks. I knew, and I believed he knew, how those negotiations would end. I want to be accurate about what I felt in that moment by the window, because the accurate version is less satisfying than the version I had imagined. I had imagined, at various points over 22 years, that the arrival of this moment would involve something powerful and releasing, some form of emotional discharge commensurate with the length and weight of what I had been carrying. What I actually felt was a kind of flat, precise completion, the cognitive satisfaction of a long sequence arriving at its expected conclusion. Whatever heat had driven me into the law library at 20 years old, whatever sharpness had kept me working past midnight in my early 30s, it had been converted over the years and through the work into something more functional and considerably less warm. I had become very good at converting feeling into strategy. The conversion had been so thorough and so sustained that the original material was no longer accessible in any form I recognized as emotion. The restructuring agreement was finalized 6 weeks after the initial creditors' meeting. The Davenport Holding Company survived. I had not sought its liquidation, and would not have benefited from it. A distressed sale of the assets would have returned less value to creditors, created collateral damage for hundreds of workers and subcontractors whose livelihoods were connected to the company's operations, and would have been, as a resolution, crude. What I wanted was governance, the ability to implement, from within the institutional structure of the company itself, the opposite of what that structure had historically been used to accomplish. The restructuring agreement gave the creditor block, of which my fund was the largest representative, board representation rights proportional to our debt position. We appointed 2 directors. I chaired the newly constituted Governance and Audit Committee. Within 90 days of closing, we retained an independent forensic accounting firm to review the company's historical procurement practices going back 12 years. The forensic review took 8 months. Its findings were specific and documented, a pattern of procurement irregularities spanning more than a decade, including contracts awarded through processes shaped by relationships with officials who had not disclosed those relationships, public subsidies received on the basis of certifications that were not fully accurate, and several instances of what the forensic team characterized in the report as coordinated regulatory pressure applied against competitive bidders in certain contract cycles. The executives identified in the report were removed. The findings were disclosed to the relevant regulatory authorities as required. Harrison Davenport, who had been nominally retired from active management for several years, became the subject of a regulatory inquiry arising from the disclosed findings. The inquiry resulted in a civil settlement and, more consequentially, a public record that attached specific documented conduct to a name that had previously moved through institutional spaces without friction. The name that had opened doors for 2 generations began, in certain rooms, to close them. Kyle retained his equity. He was not removed from the company. His operational role was restructured, his authority circumscribed by the new governance framework, but he remained a shareholder and maintained a nominal senior title. I had not sought to destroy him personally. That was not the point, and it would not have been the right point even if I had wanted it to be. The point was governance. The point was that the company, which had been used as a weapon, whose regulatory and political relationships had been deployed to dismantle 2 people who had built something through honest work, now operated under a governance structure designed to prevent that from happening again. Kyle Davenport's presence in the company, circumscribed and overseen, was itself part of what had been accomplished. He got to stay. He just had to stay differently. The foundation was the final element, and the one I had been planning for longer than any other. I announced it at a brief, factual press conference. The foundation would carry my parents' name. Its mission, legal defense resources and access to fair financing for small and mid-sized business owners facing regulatory or legal challenges without the institutional relationships to navigate them on equal terms. The initial capitalization was $7 million, funded entirely from my personal resources. The service delivery model had been designed over 6 months with attorneys and financial advisors. Specific mechanisms by which a business owner facing a regulatory action could access legal representation and financial support while due process ran its course, not guaranteed outcomes. Access to the process, the press coverage connected the foundation to the Davenport restructuring, which had been covered in the business press. My parents called me the evening of the announcement. My father said he didn't know what to say, which was one of only 3 or 4 times in my adult life I had heard him say that. My mother talked for 45 minutes, and I held the phone against my ear in my office, looking at nothing specific, letting her. At the end she asked, "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said. It was the true answer and not the complete one. About 2 months after the restructuring closed, Kyle sent a message through an intermediary. He wanted to have lunch. The implication was clear enough. Some version of closure, or perhaps a conversation that adult men sometimes attempt when the adversarial phase of a long relationship has ended and there is nothing left to negotiate. The kind of conversation that carries the freight of everything that went before and pretends to be casual. I declined through my office. I said I didn't think a meeting would serve any productive purpose, and I wished him well in the company's next chapter under its new governance structure. There was nothing more to say, not because I was punishing him or withholding something he deserved, but because there was genuinely nothing left in any exchange with Kyle Davenport that served any purpose I still understood how to want. The long game was finished. Every component of it had arrived at its intended conclusion. The thing that had driven 22 years of work was no longer unresolved, and sitting across from him in a restaurant, I was aware, would require me to perform an intimacy I did not have the equipment for, and would not provide me with anything I was capable of receiving. My parents came to visit that winter. It was the first time they had stayed at my apartment. My mother organized the kitchen without asking, which was exactly her. My father found a coffee shop 3 blocks away on the first morning and declared it adequate, which from him was high praise, and he went back every morning after that at 7 a.m. and sat at the same table and read whatever was on his phone, and then came back to help with breakfast. We ate dinner together every night for 5 days. We talked about the neighborhood, about people from home, about the clinic where my mother worked, about nothing much and everything adjacent to it. We did not, in 5 days, talk directly about the foundation, or the restructuring, or the Davenport Company, or the investigation 22 years earlier. We talked around the perimeter of all of it, the way families develop habits of circumnavigation around the things that are too large and too structural to address directly. The center of the room held what it held, and we gave it the space it required. On the last morning at breakfast, my father looked at me across the table for a moment. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands the way he did, the way he always had. He said, "Don't let it be the only thing." He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the window, at the city morning coming through, at whatever he was seeing. I said, "It isn't." He nodded, the slow, acknowledging nod that means he has heard you without yet deciding whether he believes you. And he went back to his coffee and I went back to mine, and the morning light laid itself across the table between us, and the city made its usual sounds outside. What I thought, sitting there, was this. I had spent 22 years converting every available personal resource, time, attention, feeling, relationship, the ordinary accumulations of a life, into a single project. The project was complete. It had succeeded in every dimension I had designed it to succeed in. The mechanism had been understood, replicated, refined, and ultimately turned back on those who had deployed it. A company that had been used as an instrument of institutional cruelty now operated under governance designed to prevent exactly that use. A foundation named after 2 people who had built something through honest work and had it taken from them would provide, going forward, the one resource whose absence had made the difference. These were real things. They mattered. And there was a person who had done them who was now sitting at a breakfast table with his parents in a city they had never visited before, holding a coffee cup, looking at the morning light, and who was aware, in a way that had no particular drama to it, no revelation, just a plain and somewhat delayed recognition, that the architecture of the last 22 years had been built around a single organizing point, and that point was now resolved, and he did not entirely know what he was without it. The project had required him to become someone who was very good at waiting, very good at the long sequential deployment of preparation, very comfortable with isolation and very practiced at converting personal warmth into strategic energy. It had required him to treat every personal relationship as a resource allocation problem, and every emotion as a signal to be processed rather than experienced. It had made him, in the specific domain he had built it for, formidable in ways that still surprised him occasionally. It had also made him, in the domain of ordinary life, someone who was going to have to learn things almost from scratch. My father's nod meant something like, "I see what you've done, and I'm proud of it, and I'm not sure it left you whole." It meant, "I raised you to build something, and you built something extraordinary, and I hope the building wasn't the only thing." I looked at the morning light on the table. I thought about what it would mean to let the next part be about something other than strategy, whether the person I'd become in the service of this project had sufficient remaining capacity for that, whether the skills of patience and discipline and long, sequential thinking could be redirected, or whether they were so thoroughly oriented in one direction that reorientation would require dismantling something structural. I did not know the answer. I sat with the not knowing, which was itself a different kind of experience than I was used to. I had spent 22 years in situations where not knowing was a problem to be solved by acquiring more information, more preparation, more structural understanding. This was not that kind of not knowing. This was the ordinary human uncertainty of someone standing at the end of one long chapter and looking at the blank page of the next one, without any map. My father finished his coffee. My mother came in from the bedroom with her bag over her shoulder, ready for the airport, already talking about something she needed to do when she got back. My father stood up and put on his jacket. He looked at me once more, and this time his expression was simpler. Just the particular warmth of a man, looking at his son and seeing him clearly, without illusion, and finding that what's there is enough. They left for the airport. I stood at the window after their car turned the corner. The city was going about its business below me, indifferent and persistent, producing its ordinary sounds of traffic and machinery and the general hydraulics of large numbers of people going about their lives. I stood there for a long time. I was not thinking about Kyle Davenport. I was not thinking about the foundation, or the restructuring, or the long sequence of decisions and disciplines that had brought everything to its current configuration. I was thinking about the coffee shop 3 blocks away, the one my father had declared adequate, and about whether it would still be open this late in the morning, and about whether it was the kind of place you could sit for a while without anyone needing you to be anywhere else. I picked up my jacket, I put it on, I closed the apartment door behind me, and walked down the stairs and out into the November morning. The air was cold and clear the way November air sometimes is. The particular quality of cold that makes the city look sharp, makes the edges of things distinct in a way that softer weather obscures. I turned left out of the building, the way my father had gone every morning, and walked 3 blocks to the coffee shop and sat at the window table he had used, and ordered what I imagined he had ordered, and looked at the street. The coffee was good. Outside, the city went about its business, patient and unconcerned with any of it. I sat there and let the morning be just the morning, which was harder than it sounds and not, I thought, entirely impossible. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.